Welcome to the Profectus Podcast. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Leiting. He is one of our veterinarians here. I am Brandon Rodriguez. I am a nutritionist with Profectus Livestock. Today, we're going to be covering starting out cattle. We're going to start off by going over some individual things that you need to look at for beef on dairy calves. We're going to be talking about doing some bunk scoring and kind of how to manage the bunks on receiving cattle. Then we're going to wrap things up a little bit by going over just some differences between how you would start maybe Western beef type cattle compared to these beef on dairy animals.
Brandon, one of the things we see on these calves coming out of hog barns, they're fed much different than what we would think of with other commercial production. And what do you see is important to start these calves in feedlots?
Yeah, so when you get these beef on dairy guys in, as you mentioned, they are fed quite a bit of a different diet than what we normally see a 5-weight animal come into a feed yard as. So I think one thing is to keep the energy levels decently high in these first receiving diets, right? They're used to being on a high starch, high energy diet. Bringing them back to a very high forage based diet can typically cause maybe some nutrition plus health problems, right? So like intakes can be low. They're kind of naive to those forages, depending on where you're getting these cattle from. You know, if they are coming from the hog barn setting, they've probably never seen a very forage-based diet before, so it's kind of foreign to them, and they don't really want to go and eat it. Some of these cattle may come out of like a backgrounding type yard where they do see some silage or hay beginning. Not as big a deal for them, but especially with these cattle coming out of a hog barn, keeping a grain-based, high-energy diet is super important. If you can, it's really good to know where you're getting the cattle from, kind of what the diet is, and if you can match that diet the best, that's kind of your goal there. So,
A lot of times in native calves, we're stepping them up, and we're coming out of these hog barns on some pretty high energy diets, and we have to be careful that we don't step them down too far. It's just the opposite of what we're dealing with in other commercial production.
Exactly. And to that point, one of the best things you can do is if you know the people you're buying these cattle from, you have good communication with them. Say they are in a hog barn, they're getting a complete feed. If you can buy that same complete feed, get it delivered to your place, and maybe start them on that feed. What I tell guys is maybe do 2 days of just that complete feed. After that, do 2 days of a 25 or a 75-25 blend of your complete feed and TMR, and then 2 days of 50-50, 2 days of 25-75, and then all the way onto the TMR. It's a workup of about 8 days to transition them all the way onto that TMR. But from what we've seen, that tends to really get these cattle eating well, getting them started with minimal drops in feed intake. So if they were eating 10 to 11 pounds of dry matter at the hog barns, they usually come in and they maybe drop half a pound to a pound just due to traveling stress, and they work up on feed really, really well for you.
So bringing in a like diet certainly helps them come to the bunk. Many of these calves have never seen a bunk. So getting them up when they come, moving them to the bunk, finding a like feed that they're used to can certainly help them transition.
Yep. And then for, specifically for these cattle coming out of a hog barn, Dr. Leiting, what have you seen with maybe some of the issues with some of these bed pack barns and arrival on calves?
Yeah, no, we certainly like them to come into bed pack barns. They're coming off of slats in these barns, and that's a good thing. But they have never seen a twig or a corn stalk or a piece of hay or straw, and they can really want to tank up on those products. So we try to bed them just enough to give the bed pack some good cover, because if they tank up on those dry forage products, pretty soon we're dealing with bloats, and we can't get them to come up on feed. Because that's all new to them. And we have to remember, in most of these calves, they're still half Holstein. Yep. And they will eat and lick and chew everything.
Yep.
So what's your goal, Brandon, in how much to feed these calves when they first come in? I get that question a lot. How do you manage that?
Yeah, so it kind of depends. What I would say is if you are bringing in that same complete feed as what they were on previously, then I'm a little more aggressive, right? Then you're in communications with those guys there. You kind of probably know what their intakes were, at least a rough guess of what their intakes were at those barns. And I would start them off maybe a pound per head per day less, maybe a pound and a half per head per day less than that. If you're not going to go that route and you're going to go with a full TMR on get go, I would say you want to start them off somewhere between 1.25 to 1.5% of their body weight on a dry matter basis. That would be the goal. And then as you get that going, and as you start to see those cattle come up to the bunk more and eat, then it's just a matter of kind of reading the bunk and working them up on feed, pretty much like you would see in a normal Western calf for the most part. So
We talk a lot about reading the bunk, and you see people that are really good at it, and some people that maybe aren't so good at it. So, what makes a good bunk reader, and what suggestions would you have for people?
yeah, so the things that I always tell guys to do when you're reading bunks is, it doesn't matter if you're feeding once a day or twice a day. It's kind of the same goals here. You want to get a couple observations at the bunk, right? So in an ideal world, say you feed cattle at 7 a.m. Everything's done being fed by say 9 a.m. I would say around lunchtime you want to go out there and look at the bunk. Take a look at it, see what's out there, see how much has disappeared. If you're not going to feed again in the afternoon, I would still go out around 3 to 5 p.m. again.
Okay.
Look at that bunk again, see what's disappeared, see what's gone, and just take some notes, right? And if you're seeing maybe 30% of the bunk is cleaned up at lunchtime, and then maybe another 20% is cleaned up at the afternoon, that's 50% of the feed is gone. You're probably pretty good for the night, right? And then if you're feeding twice a day, obviously that's that third bunk read. You'd still read them in the morning, still read them at night or in the afternoon around lunchtime. And then as you go into that 3 to 5 o'clock feeding period, read them again. And kind of at that time, if you're going to feed them twice a day, you would just want to see crumbles, right? You'd want to maybe see a thin layer of feed at the bottom of the bunk. You can see the bottom of the bunk probably, but you want to have some feed still available for them to kind of go and eat if they want to. The next morning, you want to see kind of that same thing, right? You want to see just crumbles. You don't ever want that bunk to really be super slicked up, because then you're kind of behind them. You don't know how far behind them you are because you may not know when that bunk actually went slick. That bunk could have gone slick at 10 p.m. the night before, 11 p.m., the night before. Then you're feeding at 7 a.m. Well, that's 8 hours, 9 hours without feed. So having those crumbles on the bunk is a really good sign. The other thing that I tell guys too to watch is when you do see feed left over in that bunk, what is it, right?
Yep.
Is it all one thing? Are they leaving a bunch of corn in the bunk? Are they leaving a bunch of hay in the bunk? Are they leaving, if you're a guy that maybe blends grass hay, alfalfa hay, and corn stalks together, is it just a bunch of corn stalks in the bunk? And that's kind of telling to your nutritionist, right? Let us know, because if they're starting to sort, then there's things that we can manipulate in that diet to maybe get away from that, and they will start cleaning that bunk up really well for you. Plus, if they're sorting, then the diet that we're formulating really isn't the diet that they're eating, and the nutrients that we want them to get out of that diet, that ratio is getting way off, and we could see some problems there. So.
One of the things that we talk about often is length of cut on forages that have been ground, and oftentimes that leads to sorting or the product they leave behind that we think is part of the diet, but the calf doesn't.
Yep.
So how do you manage that?
Yeah, length of forage on a grind is pretty important. I always tell guys you want to be at least 3 inches screen if you're going to grind. If you're going to bring in like a custom grinder, a 3-inch screen is probably the smallest you want to go, or I'm sorry, the largest you want to go.
Yeah.
2 inches to me is a really good grind, especially in some of these diets where we're feeding, a higher energy roughage source where there's not, or a higher energy diet where there's not as much of a roughage source in there. The fluffier and the longer stem it is, the easier it is for them to go and pick around it and push it out and move it. So, if you're looking at like, a backgrounder type diet for something where it's a majority hay, it's maybe less of an issue on grind there. But when you start to get in these higher energy, more nutrient dense type diets, they can sort those a lot easier when there's only 10 to 15% roughage in that diet. It's a lot easier for them to sort. So the grind becomes way more important. And like corn stalks is one thing that even if you try to grind it fine, it's really hard. So a lot of times we do typically see cattle really sort corn stalks, really no matter what the grind is. So if you can avoid feeding corn stalks to these starting cattle, that's probably a really good idea. Focus more on your grass hays, your alfalfa hays, even like road ditch hay, CRP hay. It can be rough hay, but maybe just not as rough as corn stalks. And then you can save those corn stalks for either later on in the diet or other cattle. So
yeah, just grind so much better.
Yes. Yep.
Speak to native cattle and starting them versus these beef on dairies. We're bringing in cattle, maybe it's from out west or down south,
Yep.
and we have no idea what they're coming off of.
Yeah.
How do you manage those starts?
Yeah, so the big difference between beef on dairy and Western cattle, as far as starting and receiving cattle, is just the idea that these beef on dairy animals, like we said before, are coming off of a high starch, high grain, high energy diet, right? They don't see a lot of forage in their whole life. Whereas this is the exact opposite usually for Western cattle, right? 5 weights, 4 weights, 6 weight calves. Maybe they are coming off of a background or a preconditioning yard, or maybe they're just coming off the pasture. Maybe they're weaned, maybe they're not weaned, whatever. But majority of their life they have eaten forage, right? You know, long stem hay, ground forage, something. So the big difference that I see in starting, beef on dairy compared to Western cattle would be that when you bring in Western cattle, what I like to do is just make sure that hay is full of, or that bunk is full of hay when they arrive, right? A lot of those cattle may have never seen a bunk. You don't really, maybe you do know they were backgrounded, maybe you don't know if they were preconditioned or backgrounded. But having them find that bunk in the water right away is the most important thing. Any guys who have ever started, Western cattle, you'll get them in the pen, they'll do a couple laps, they'll find some water, and then hopefully if you have enough hay filled up over the top of that bunk, they'll go start eating that hay. And then once you get them on just finding the bunk, what I tend to tell guys to do is keep that bunk full of hay for maybe a day, 2 days, and then top dress your TMR on top of it. So say say if you're shooting for like that, still you're probably going to try to shoot for that 1.5% of dry matter for body weight. And if you're going to do that and that's your goal, you really want to get that into them on like day 2 or 3. So maybe day 1 and day 2, you take half of that and top dress it over some hay just to get them used to coming to the bunk. Especially for guys in the Midwest that are feeding a lot of silage, maybe high moisture corn, maybe earlage fermented feeds. Yeah. Some of these cattle maybe have never seen that before, so that fermentation smells kind of rough on them. So diluting that with some of that hay really helps them to at least get to eating it. And then once they taste it, they like it and they want more of it. So, just doing that for maybe a day or 2, top dressing some hay with your TMR works really well for starting Western cattle. And then from there, then it's just a matter of stepping them up, right? Same thing, read the bunk, pay attention to what they're eating. You want those crumbs in the bunk. And if you're seeing crumbs, typically what I tell guys, and this goes for beef on dairy or Western cattle, don't make any big changes to your bunk deliveries for 2 to 3 days, right? Because environments change, weather changes, eating patterns can change. There could be anomalies in a day where, hey, the bunk is slick, way earlier than it normally is. But then you bump them, and that's the first day that's happened. You bump them, now you're way ahead of them. Yeah. So if that happens the next day, then on day 3 of that little cycle, you can bump them, right? But you don't want to just make rash decisions every day, right? The other thing people ask me a lot of times is a lot of guys are starting calves in the fall. With these beef on dairies, though, they can start in the middle of winter, they can start in the spring, they can start in the summer. A lot of times we have some weird weather variations in those times of the year, right? This past winter, we've had days where it's been 70 and the next day it's been 22. So, understanding these weather patterns, right? And when you're receiving cattle, knowing when you're getting them in, knowing what the weather is going to be like, it's a big deal to kind of plan the idea of, okay, they're coming in on a 70-degree day. They're probably not going to eat that great, but in 3 days, it's going to be 20. We may start to see these intakes ramp up once it gets cold. And just know that, hey, we might be chasing these cattle for a little bit, but keep an eye on those things, right? I know it sounds really simple and really
kind of looking out there a little ways.
Yeah, that sounds kind of like, oh my God, yeah, that's that's everyone should know that. But it's one of those things where a lot of people, maybe don't look ahead, right? They just see what's going on today, they don't pay attention, or they got a lot of other stuff going on. Just note that, hey, watch the weather. That's another
reading the bunk and forecasting
the weather. Coming. Yeah. Right. Weather can play a huge role on intakes, even in a building, open lot, doesn't matter. It's going to affect you. So
yeah. At Profectus, we balance our diets by amino acids to energy versus the traditional way of crude protein and energy. And I think in a former life, you would have maybe made more step-up rations than what you do today in amino acid balancing diets. So what's the difference between the industry and what we're doing?
Yeah, so before I worked here, I did the same thing. Balanced diets. We looked at NEG, ADF, NDF, crude protein, those kinds of things. And we would typically start these cattle. Say if it was a beef on dairy, I would have started them at like a 52 mega cal. And then worked them up 52, 54, 56, 58, 60, 62, so on and so on.
So 6 or 7, 5, 6,
7 diets. Yep.
Okay.
So, you know, with the way we do diets today, or the way I do diets today, since I've been working with Profectus, what we can do is we keep that rumen so healthy. You know, part of that's the amino acid to energy ratio, better utilization of feedstuffs. The other part is what we look at from like a rumen degradable nitrogen, rumen degradable peptide standpoint. The rumen's full of healthy microbes. We see really good feed intakes. We see cattle get started pretty well in our diets. And having that rumen be healthy and that animal be healthy allows us to make bigger NEG jumps. You know, even though we don't really pay attention to NEG necessarily on our diets, we watch it, right? And we can make a 6 megacal jump in NEG, a 5 megacal jump in NEG, whatever that would be, and not see issues.
Still take care of the microbes.
Exactly. You know, the rumen is set up to handle those bigger jumps. And we see cattle not back off on feed, not have bloats, not have acidosis issues. You know, the diets are just balanced in a way to where animals can easily adapt to these changes, pretty seamlessly.
Yep.
Whereas in my past life, if I went from a 48 to a 55 NEG diet like I have done here before, I would be a little nervous.
Right.
You know, I would probably wouldn't do that. But nowadays, I'm not that scared to do that kind of stuff. So.
Yeah, so many feedlots you're probably dealing with maybe even only 4 diets total through the entire growing phase.
Yeah, typically what you're going to see depends on the cattle, depends on the producer.
Sure. Yeah.
But a lot of times we'll have what we call like a starter ration, which is basically just 14 days. Kind of get them on feed, get them going. We're not too concerned about gain or efficiency at that standpoint. We just really want to get them on a diet that's going to mimic or at least set them up for the next phase, right? And then from there, we'll have maybe a grower diet that will take them to about 800, 850 pounds, a grower diet that will take them to about 1,200 pounds, and then a finishing diet.
Yeah.
So, you're talking 4 to 5 diets tops, depending on the type of cattle. But
Yep. Plus diets to manage.
Yep.
Bigger deliveries because you only got 4 diets in the whole yard.
Yep. Yeah. Guys have seemed to kind of like that idea too.
Yep.
So.
You bet. Brandon, I think we've covered the starting of beef on dairy calves pretty well today.
Yeah. No, I think we did. And if any of the producers out there have any other questions or need some more information on kind of what we presented today, feel free to reach out to your Profectus Livestock rep. Thank you for listening, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and share.